Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Giving Tuesday special transmission from Purpose. We're here to talk about storytelling. So let me just introduce us. This is Sarah Kennedy, and Sarah has worked in nonprofits, social movements, and political campaigns throughout her career. She's done a lot of work on LGBT rights and also gun safety. This is Megan Anhalt, and Megan is a social change, media, branding expert, and she's worked across the public sector and non-profit sector and private sector as well, and done more things than I could even reasonably mention. And my name is Anna Solwick, and I've also worked across the public and private sector in a lot of human rights issues and environmental issues and so on. And we're all senior strategists here at Purpose, and we're here to talk about storytelling and campaigning and storytelling for impact. And I think it's a nice kind of opportunity on Giving Tuesday to talk about stories, because everybody's been busily sort of working on their campaign materials for fundraising around Giving Tuesday. And I think that as every campaigner knows, storytelling is hugely important for making impact and for reaching people. And I mean, it does all kinds of things. It's able to demonstrate the relevance of your work, to kind of reach new audiences who might not have realized that they had a relationship with what you're doing. It kind of makes things pleasingly sort of specific, to enable the activation of empathy, of inspiration, and so on. And it shows how people can make a difference, and shows how people kind of can get involved in the work. And so we're going to talk sort of generally about storytelling today. If you'd like to ask questions as we go along, please just type them in there, and we'll kind of see them. We'll look at questions probably sort of toward the end, or maybe we'll see how we go. Maybe we'll answer questions as we go as well. But maybe just to sort of kick off, maybe it would be a good place to start to sort of ask, around fundraising, it's really important that we make our members or our audience feel like they really are part of the story. And I was just wondering how you guys how you do that in regard to fundraising.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. I think one of the big things that a lot of people talk about, particularly around fundraising and running fundraising campaigns on days like Giving Tuesday, is making sure that you have that report back, and that your members know sort of what that impact will be, and really being able to tell that story and thank them, one, for their contribution, but really like entice them to stay involved, to be a part of that narrative, to be a part of that story over the coming months and year. That way they really like feel that impact personally.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would say. When you're asking people for money, right, you want to make sure that you're having something specific that their money is going to go to. You're not just going to say, oh, and if you donate today, our organization will be able to serve, 200 more people with our services this month, right? You can say that, but you also want to make sure that you report back to the people who did donate, let them know, here are the real people who benefited from the services, just making them feel like they're part of the story, and you're not only just asking them for things all the time, but that you're actually telling them what their money did, and it's not just some organization over here, but that it's actually they're a part of the organization, and what they're doing is really important to it.
Yeah, and Sarah brings up a good point too, because it's not just having that sort of immediate thank you and report back in the short term, but it's also being able to report back months down the line to say, hey, remember when you gave us that money 4 months ago? Like, this is an example of a story of a person that we were able to help with some of those funds, and really like making them feel personally connected to that story. And I think that's definitely a theme that carries across storytelling, is being able to build that personal connection, that human connection to people, so that they feel that they've been able to have an impact and understand sort of where that's gone.
Right, and I think another thing that really kind of comes to mind for me is that if you're able to show the impact on a person-by-person level, these are the people we're reaching, or these are the impacts that we're having on a really small level, then people are able to relate their small dollar donations to the impact, and they're able to feel like, okay, if this does mean that I'm feeding, a particular person, or if I'm putting a coal-efficient stove into the hands of a particular person, that is a really kind of tangible impact that I can have in the world. And so I wonder what then, the way that we tell stories around fundraising and the way that we kind of incorporate people into the narrative of change is one kind of storytelling. And another kind of storytelling is how we're sort of demonstrating the value of what we're doing to people who might not have thought about it before. And I feel like though that sort of second category of stories is sort of almost, there are a whole lot of standalone stories that we're going out into the world to try and find and to bring to our audiences. And I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about like what makes a great story. What's the kinds of stories that will change minds, that will inspire action, that will make the dollars roll in, sure, but also that will really kind of like change the way that people think about the issues that we're working with?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of characteristics that we've seen that really become defining of what makes a good story. And when we say a good story, it's a story that is effective in driving action and driving people to be inspired to do something, because that's sort of the world that we all work in, is really stories for activation and for doing something. And I think in order for that to be effective, and as we talked about before, you need that human connection, something that feels, so that like emotional connection. You see this a lot in LGBT work as well, and I'll let you speak a little bit to that, and that like finding those like common themes that everyone can relate to regardless of their background can be a really compelling part of driving people to action.
Yeah, Megan brings up a great point. I'm going to ask everybody to go in the Wayback Machine here to like 10 years ago when marriage equality was not a reality at all in the U.S. And some of the early and really great work that we were doing around marriage at the time was talking about these 1,138, I don't even know if that's the right number, but number of federal rights and benefits that that folks who were in same-sex partnerships were not actually receiving, right? And we learned that message didn't really resonate if you're someone who's living in Nebraska and you don't know any gay people and you're like, oh, 1,000 benefits? I don't even know what that means, right?
Yeah.
So there was a real shift actually in the LGBT rights movement when we realized just telling facts wasn't going to work. We really needed to pivot to stories and what's something that people really could relate to. Being in love, wanting to share your life with someone, right? So we set out to really look for very amazing and compelling gay and lesbian couples and having them share their stories, because it's one thing to say, oh, some nebulous couple can't have, doesn't have this particular one federal benefit, sure, but if you say, here, I'll use an example of this amazing couple we worked with the ACLU this past year, Jeff and Jeremiah. They're kind of viral video stars. I don't know if you've seen their proposal video on YouTube, but you should check it out. Jeff, here's Jeff and Jeremiah. They live in Texas. They are not able to get married. They've been together for this many years. They share a home and a life together. So it's really about making something personal, and it doesn't necessarily have to mean personal to the one person you're trying to reach with your story, but making it relatable.
Yeah, and I think like on that, it becomes really important to sort of like reframe a narrative and connect with people in a different way, and in a surprising way. Upworthy did a study of their content and found that the content that was getting the most views, it was getting the most shares, it was the most viral online, was that was obviously having that human connection. It was really like surprising people. People like to have their mind blown in that way. You always see those 10 mind-blowing facts about X. But also this idea of like having a hero and a villain as well, and being able to really like pull for someone, but also have sort of the foil to that, and understanding whether it's another person or a force or the politics or something else that just feels unfair. And it was really sort of setting up that hero-villain dynamic. Also, there's an element of storytelling, too, that's being a little bit in the right place in the right time. And in crafting stories, a lot of that is deliberate, right? It's paying attention to what's going on in the narrative. It's identifying sort of these common connections that people are having and being able to use that. Another great example of a story that was created, a video for marriage equality in Australia. some of you might have seen this video called It's Time. And what they did tremendously well is they were able to sort of flip the debate on its head, in that they weren't going out immediately saying, hey, we're talking about marriage equality here, but they really showed the first-person interaction of a courtship and someone sort of falling in love and being in that experience. And it isn't revealed until the very end that that is a same-sex relationship. And so obviously you're building that human connection with people and understanding and feeling that experience that we've all had, and then sort of having that reveal. And I think reveal is another sort of key element to a really good story, is being able to sort of surprise people or show them something that they hadn't originally thought about, or really showing things in a different way.
And so when you, so a lot of people who are working in the sector, they wonder, like, how do I find these stories? How do I find really great stories to help move my audience along? Do you have any advice on where people can look for these kinds of stories?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stories are right there in their community. I mean, they're in their supporters, and people who do storytelling well, I mean, are often sourcing those stories from their own community. It's posting, a comment or a question on their Facebook page and getting a couple of responses, and instead of just ignoring sort of that one-off comment, actually sending them a message and saying, hey, I would love to talk to you and hear more about your story. I mean, actively soliciting responses and stories via email around like issues that you're interested in, or you think that you're going to run a campaign around something and you want to talk to other people that have sort of gone through that. The organization Fast Food Forward did a great job with this when they realized that there was a recurring instance of wage theft in fast food working jobs. And so they sort of went out to their community and said, hey, we want to hear your stories of when you've been asked to clock in or out early and keep working, or sort of have these other things going on. And they had sort of a cascade of these stories come in. And so that both help sort of strengthen something that you might be interested in campaigning on or talking to your audience on, but it also gives these like real personal connection stories that happen to real people. And a tactic that could be really powerful for this, particularly in campaigning and online organizing, is being able to send an email out from that person's perspective and really letting them tell their story in their own voice. It just allows people to make that personal connection and understand sort of their role in being able to combat that challenge and be able to create change, because it's coming from one person.
Yes. And so would you, if you had somebody like that, would you help them to tell their story? Would you kind of offer them a lot of coaching on their story, or do you just let them speak in their own voice?
I could probably answer that. I spent many years actually being a spokesperson trainer. So you definitely want people to be telling their own story from their own voice. Yeah. That being said, anyone who speaks in front of camera, including the three of us, right, we wrote down the questions ahead of time. We wrote out some talking points and spent some time thinking about what we were going to say to you all today, because we know we have a limited amount of time. And so something, whenever I've worked with folks and found people with really good stories, I've not just thrown them to the wolves and said, okay, you go up on this stage right now at our press conference and just take any question from any reporter, right? Or why don't you sit down and write an email blast, which you've never done, by yourself, asking for money for our organization, right? So it's about sitting with that person, hearing their story, and then offering them some guidance. It's not about rewriting or revisioning it at all, but it's just about saying, okay, here are the three things that I heard when you were talking that I think could really resonate with folks, and just giving them kind of some tips on how to shape it and make them honestly feel more comfortable, right? Yes. You never want to send someone to a television interview or to a video shoot without practicing the story ahead of time, right? Right. Because storytelling, it's a little bit of an art. It's also a little bit of a science. And practice, honestly, really does make perfect. The more times you say your story out loud, the more you think, oh, when I said this story to these 4 people I was practicing in front of, they all seem to really like this part. So I'm going to make sure to kind of flesh that out or emphasize that. So I would say definitely working with people to get their story in the best place possible is really the way to go. And it's really just about coaching them so they feel the most comfortable telling their story.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think it really is a matter of balance, because getting people to that point where they do feel really comfortable and where they can feel what works in their own story is really important. But then we've all read emails that sound exactly like the authorial voice of the organization that's sending it. You know, they're signed off from somebody else, but they have the exact same structure. The links are all in the same places and so on. And we're probably all guilty of that at some point. So what do you think? What are you looking for? Are you looking for an uplifting story every time or something else?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. And I think a lot of times, particularly in the advocacy world, we tend to try to be a little too earnest and a little too polished. And I think the stories that resonate the most can be a little bit messy, and they're not totally structured, and they have that authenticity. But I think the key is really, we call it this moment of like crisis-tunity, being able to set up the problem, understand the crisis, but not leave people feeling overwhelmed and they can't make a difference and they can't have that impact. And so being able to take that crisis and really show the opportunity within that and use that as like a rallying cry to bring people together and allow them to have impact together, rather than sort of leaving people feeling like depressed and overwhelmed and sad. Because nobody wants to take action after you're sort of in this place of like, oh God, this is such a big problem and there's nothing we can do about it. So being able to really like show that optimism of what can happen, particularly being able to focus on how one person can be able to have that impact as well and be a part of sort of this larger group.
Yeah, interesting. And so do you feel like storytelling is about reaching out and activating the people who are already on your side, or is it about changing minds?
I mean, I think it's about both.
Right.
You're always going to have, I call them like your 10% of people who love you, your 10% of people who hate you and will never be on your side, but everybody else in the middle is really, they're movable, right? So one of the terms we use is the movable middle, and really thinking about, you know, I'll go back to the example of marriage equality because I spent so much time working on that. Is one of the things we realized when we were doing this work across the country is that there were so many people who hadn't had the space or the opportunity to really think about how they felt about it. And so one thing that we did, which we found was really helpful, is we actually gave people who had a journey. They had started out saying, I don't know that I support marriage for gay and lesbian couples. But, you know, throughout, you know, weeks, months, years, whatever, they had a child come out, or, you know, they met a neighbor or a coworker who wanted to get married, who happened to be gay. And we gave people who went on that journey, I mean, right, we also give space to Barack Obama, our president, to talk about his journey there. But, you know, everyday people who came from one place but were touched by, you know, a personal story, a personal connection, somebody they know, and they ended up changing their mind. And so one thing that can be really effective when you're actually trying to move hearts and minds and to change people from not caring or not really knowing to not only being on your side but actually taking an action is giving people the space to not agree with you initially and letting people know that there are other people like them who didn't have a strong feeling about it first, and letting them tell the story of their journey and how it became something that was important to them.
What do you mean by that? Could you maybe talk about how you did that? Like
sure,
the, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, so it could be something where, you know, you have someone maybe telling their story in a video, or you know, in a blog entry on your organization's website, right? Or maybe they're authoring an op-ed in a local paper where they say, you know what, here's who I am, this is why I didn't agree with this issue, right? Then you know, my son who lives far away, you know, came to visit for the holidays. He said he wanted to bring someone. You know, he came out and let us know that he was in this long-term committed relationship. I suddenly realized I couldn't sit on the sidelines and not have an opinion about marriage equality anymore. This was something that affected me. It affected people like my children, and it's something that everybody should be able to do. So sort of giving the space for people to not necessarily be right? When you think about your audience, you think, oh, these are all the people who are supporters and are already on our side. But the only way to grow your movement is to get people to join who aren't on your side yet, or people who are maybe ambivalent about it and they're not sure that they're on your side. So it's about kind of giving people opportunities to identify themselves in different points of entry into your work.
Huh. And so is that sort of every time you campaign, do you have a sort of a deliberate strategy of a story for every audience sector, or do you try to get somebody to tell a story that will appeal to all of those sectors?
I mean, I think it depends on the goals, right? So I think like it depends on what the campaign is seeking to do, and if it's seeking to reach new people or change people's minds, I think like that's one audience. And I think the way that you would approach that is both being able to tell a story that connects with the audience outside of your existing audience, but it's also being able to tell a story that's compelling enough that really empowers your existing audience to be able to use that story to then sort of evangelize out into their community and the people that they know and they're connected with. Because I think that's really what builds really strong stories. It's stories that can be really connecting for the individuals that already get the issue, but that also can be used as a tool to really connect with others and be able to share that story in a different way to bring others into it as well.
And could you both perhaps give some examples of how the stories that your organization has told have changed as the issue moved? So as you began to win, or as you began to lose, as the case may be, how did those stories change?
That's a really great question. I can speak a little bit to that. Again, all my examples are going to be about marriage. That is where I've spent most of my time. But that's also where we've seen a lot of wins and a lot of losses. What immediately came to mind for me when Anna just asked that question was here in New York State. I know, right? You used to not be able to get married in New York in the old days, 2009, 2010. And what we found was the organizations in New York were doing an amazing job every single year. We were getting closer and closer to winning marriage, to getting the state legislature to vote for marriage, which is really exciting. But after 2 years of losing, it was really hard. We no longer could have the same messages to our base to say, oh yeah, we're going to do this again next year, because we all believed in the years previous that we had a really good chance of winning. So in that case, we actually used a loss as a pivot to really have a little bit of an edgier tone in the stories that we were telling. We created a group called Fight Back New York, right, which is already a little more combative than the organizations who had been leading a lot of the storytelling at that time, you know, telling stories about couples and making this a real issue. You know, that was work that had already been done, and then at this point we had lost twice in a row, and we decided we literally, you know, not going to take it anymore. And so what we ended up doing was using stories that took people's anger and really fueled them to action, right? So when you asked about uplifting stories, sometimes unfortunately the story is not uplifting at all, and the story is, you all are our base. We know that you're upset about this. We're upset about it too. We're all going to work together to do something to change this. So it's, you can use a win or a loss. I think they're all opportunities.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And they are really handles that you can kind of hold on to, aren't they, to kind of to swing into action. I wonder, on a really practical question then, is how have you used influencers or high-profile people in the past? And you know, does it work? Does it ever work against you? Have any experience on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think influencers are always sort of a great thing to have in your back pocket because they come with an existing audience, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's why influencers can be so effective, because they do have a following in a way. I mean, they have a group of individuals that care about their opinion, they're interested in what they're interested in, and so because of that, they can be really powerful assets to have as a part of any campaign. And so I think some of the best ways to be able to leverage influencers, I mean, if they have a personal story and a personal connection to the issue, that's always can be sort of the most effective, because they are able to directly relate to it, and that potency sort of comes through. I think being able to bridge connections to that influencer, to others that are sort of affected by the different issues in another way, particularly in like an interviewing asset, or being able to sort of talk to them and be able to learn from them, because I think there's a lot that comes in that learning experience as well, of being able to talk to someone that's gone through something. You learn a lot, and you are sort of, as an influencer, then become a proxy of the public in going through that learning, and so that can be also sort of a powerful tool for doing that. And also just, I mean, having influencers take action, do an action, really be able to lead the way, challenge their audience and their following to do the same, can be just a great way to like bring people along that journey.
Okay.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Just my one tip about influencers is make it as easy as possible for them to engage. Right? You are asking people, why are they influencers? Because they do a lot and they are very busy. So, giving them the exact thing that you want them to do and having only one ask for them is super important.
Yeah, that's great advice. And another really sort of a practical question in terms of the way that we strategically kind of put these things together as campaigners. I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about the difference, because I think that the people who made it this far really do want to know, about the difference between storytelling and narrative in campaigns.
Yeah, I mean, I can start sort of like off that. I mean, I think a narrative is really about understanding the overall vision and the overall goal, and really understanding sort of the role that the campaign or the organization plays in reaching towards this sort of vision. And I think stories themselves, you can have many, many different stories that tell different facets of an overall narrative, and all of that, yes, and you should, and all of that should be working towards sort of one overall goal, an overall narrative. And the reason that is because it helps center people. It helps them sort of focus on what you're working to achieve. And of course, there's so many different perspectives and ways to sort of approach and be able to tell those individual stories. And a lot of times, too, people think stories have to be a long narrative or someone speaking to camera or a full email and everyone's backstory. I mean, something as simple as a Facebook graphic is a story, and you can really get a lot into that that thing by really talking about the characters. There's a hook there, having a call to action, understanding sort of what is the setup. And so I think like really thinking about stories as being sort of these like micro bite-sized pieces of an overall narrative that really sort of drives towards that impact and that vision.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I mean, and the way that we kind of knit those things together is also a really big part of how we tell stories as organizations. And I was wondering, so we've got a couple of minutes left. I was wondering whether perhaps you could share just sort of briefly a campaign where a story kind of really made the difference in what you were doing.
I think that's hopefully every campaign. Otherwise, maybe your campaign wasn't so successful. But I will share just a quick story in our 1 minute here. Purpose works with the ACLU this past year on probably one of the most fun campaigns ever, not just because it was named my big gay legal wedding, but that did help. And really what we were doing there was taking an issue that was very policy wonky, and the issue was people can get married in some states and they can't get married in other states. That's weird, right? That makes no sense. And so, obviously it's a lot more complex. I'm not a lawyer. But what we wanted to do was take something that was super complicated like that. Everyday people didn't care. Like, oh, can't you just go to New York to get married? Can't you just go to Iowa? Can't you just drive somewhere? And what we really did was we solicited stories, like Megan said, literally just asking your audience. We ended up having over 400 couples submit their story during the course of this campaign, couples who couldn't get married in their home state. What we did was, we ended up elevating some of those really key stories and helping those folks tell their own story and making this issue real. Because people don't necessarily want to hear about legalese, about different statewide initiatives. But if you have real people and real stories behind it, it makes all the difference.
Okay. And do you want to?
I can, but I think like at the end of the day, it's all about these stories are everything. Like I think that's what has personally motivated me to action. I mean, that's what gets me sort of invested in a lot of the causes that you do. And so there's so many different examples to pull from, but I think it's really just about having that compelling story that can cut through, that can connect with people, pull on your heart, and really make that human connection.
Wonderful. Okay, well, we're out of time. There have been no questions, so I'm not going to answer any. But thank you for tuning in, and we'll post this on our blog. And if you have any questions, please, write in the comments, and we'll get back to you. And yeah, thanks a lot, and happy Giving Tuesday. I hope everything goes really well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.